Welcome to Nothing But the Truth. I'm Trudy Stern. Over the past several weeks, we've spent a great deal of time examining New York's primary elections and what they may mean for the future of our city and our state. We looked at the candidates, the issues, and the growing influence of the Democratic Socialists of America and other progressive movements that are reshaping New York's political landscape. But one question really stayed with me. If these ideas continue to gain ground, what does that future actually look like? Today, we're going to look west to Seattle, Washington. Seattle isn't just another city. For decades, it has been one of America's leading laboratories for progressive governance. Many of the debates now taking center stage in New York, public safety, criminal justice reform, homelessness, drug policy, taxation, housing, education, and the expanding role of government have been playing out in Seattle for years. Whether you view those policies as successes or failures, Seattle offers a real world case study of what happens when political ideas move from campaign promises to governing. From the nationally known CHOP occupation in 2020 to ongoing debates over policing, homelessness, public drug use, business regulation, and the cost of living, Seattle has become a city that people across the country watch closely. The question isn't whether New York will become Seattle. The question is, what lessons should New Yorkers learn from Seattle's experience before they head to the polls this November? That's why today's conversation is so important. Joining me today is Ari Hoffman, host of the Ari Hoffman Show on 570 KVI in Seattle. Ari has spent years reporting on and living through the political and cultural transformation of Seattle, giving him a unique front row seat to the policies that have reshaped one of America's most influential cities. His insight has been sought by national media outlets, including Fox News, Newsmax, 60 Minutes, and The Dr. Drew Show, and he was featured in the acclaimed documentary Seattle is Dying. Ari is also a frequent speaker on college and high school campuses, including events hosted by Turning Point USA and Jewish student organizations, where he discusses public policy, free speech, and anti-Semitism. This isn't a conversation about Seattle for Seattle's sake. It's about understanding where ideas lead once they're put into practice. Because elections don't just determine who holds office, they shape the future of our communities, our quality of life, and the country we leave to the next generation. So let's get right to it. Welcome, Ari, to Nothing But the Truth.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, first of all, tell us, are you a native Seattle person? Were you born there?
No, I'm from New York, actually. I grew up in Westchester County. Went to Young Israel Scarsdale growing up, went to Westchester Day School in Ramaz, and went to Yeshiva University. So I grew up in New York. I never thought I'd live anywhere else but New York. I met my wife while I was at YU, and her family's from Seattle. And we came out here about 22, 23 years ago now. So I came out to Seattle and it was this beautiful place. I mean, you could eat off the floors in downtown Seattle. I used to joke. I mean, look, every city has its crime, every city has its hotspots, but Seattle really didn't have that. It was affordable. I was able to buy a house as a 23-year-old kid with some help from my in-laws. And then I watched the city not only become unaffordable, not only get taxed up the wazoo, but also become a crime-ridden, drug-infested cesspool. And watching that all get cleaned up for the World Cup for the past month, it's actually been really nice because you see how what our city could be again. It was a nice reminder of what Seattle used to be. And you see all these American patriots come in for the World Cup to cheer on Team USA. And it was wonderful. It was magnificent. It reminded me of the city I moved to. But when I was walking home, because I was actually covering the crowds outside the stadium on Monday night, when I was walking home, the homeless were already moving back into Seattle. And the night after the World Cup, there's already multiple shootings and multiple overdoses. And I'm thinking to myself, well, we're right back at it. That was a nice little honeymoon.
Well, okay, so if I actually landed in Seattle, not during the World Cup, but before the World Cup, describe for me what it looked like and what it felt like and why I might be saying I can't believe this is happening in America.
So the first thing you'd probably notice is an airport's an airport. You know, every airport's got its little shtick. But once you get outside the airport and you're driving on I-5 and you're heading into Seattle itself, you'll start seeing a whole bunch of debris on the freeways, which wasn't cleaned up for the World Cup, by the way. And you'll start seeing graffiti everywhere. And it contrasts with the beautiful mountains that are surrounding it. It contrasts with the beautiful views. And you just go, I don't understand. It's so pretty, yet this looks like absolute garbage. When you head into Seattle, when you get off the I-5 freeway and you enter Seattle, there will be a guy asking you for money. It'll be like New York in the 1980s. I haven't driven in New York in quite a while, but it'll be like New York in the 1980s before Giuliani. And we don't have the squeegee men. We just have the guys begging for money. And while you're driving through downtown Seattle, you will inevitably have to swerve to avoid hitting some drug addicted zombie who wandered into the middle of traffic. You will notice the tents. Now, a lot of this was actually pushed out to other parts of Seattle for the World Cup. They cleaned up the area where the stadiums are, which is right next to where the bars are, which is right next to where the hotels are. They cleaned all that up, but they shoved them to other areas. So actually, what's making news this week is the Chinatown International District. That area has been destroyed by the Democrats for about 2 decades now. They drop injection sites in there and homeless shelters, and so many people have moved out of that area entirely. It's almost a ghost town. And what happened was there's this one intersection called 12th and Jackson, which is notorious here in Seattle for its crime and drug use. And you drive down it, it looks like a scene out of The Walking Dead or any zombie movie. It's that bad. They shoved all the homeless drug addicts to that area. So now you have all these Chinatown business owners who are saying, what happened to the windfall? This was supposed to be a windfall for us for the World Cup. And in fact, we've had the worst business we've ever had because locals aren't coming down for the World Cup. And the people who came to town for the World Cup are not coming to our area. They're staying within the confines of the hotel. They're staying within the confines of the stadium area and the bars. They're not coming anywhere near us. You told us to get ready for this thing, and there's nothing, and they're furious right now. In fact, when the U.S. recently played against Belgium and lost 4-1, the group of Chinatown business owners and people who live there organized a protest on the World Cup about how the city policies actually made things worse for them during the games.
Wow. So you've been there for 22 years and you described how beautiful it was when you arrived. So Seattle wasn't always like this. What happened? Was there a defining moment? Was there a series of elections, policy decisions that changed the city? Looking back, what warning signs did people dismiss that in hindsight they shouldn't have?
This happened before I got here, but the World Trade Organization protest that everybody knows about in the late 90s, that really
Well, for
started
anybody,
off.
for anyone who doesn't know about it, tell us
Yeah.
about it.
Sure. So the WTO came to Seattle in, what was it, 1998, 99, and there were massive riots and protests by the far left here in Seattle. And that really kicked off this protest culture in Seattle. And these activists, it used to be you could ignore them. They're the fringe group out in the corner. But now they run the government. Our mayor, Seattle Mayor Socialist Katie Wilson, is one of these activists who managed to get elected. And what happened was over time, they did the exact same thing you're seeing the DSA do right now, which is they looked for off year elections, they looked for small races, they infiltrated the Democrat Party, and they slowly took over the Democrat Party. The major politician who you may have heard of, you may have not heard of, who is actually behind a lot of this, the poster child for it. Her name is Kashama Sawan. She's an Indian immigrant who came here, who was married to a Microsoft millionaire. She divorced the Microsoft millionaire, got whatever settlement she did, and then decided to become a full-time activist. She got elected to the Seattle City Council, and she used her activist brigade to show up and protest anything they wanted. And that's how she rammed through a massive minimum wage increase, which destroyed the restaurants. That's how, during the summer of 2020, with the riots, with the activists rioting over George Floyd, I'll come back to that in a second, she managed to push through the defund the police, which cost us about 800 officers. She also managed to push through a tax on Amazon. And this tax was on high earners. And Amazon said, if you do this, we will leave. Amazon literally went to the next city over. New Yorkers are going to laugh. It's called Bellevue. It's not a mental hospital. It's a very high end, nice neighborhood. So Amazon literally had built a whole section of Seattle called Lake Union. They built up these office towers. They rebuilt streets. They built homeless shelters. They built, you name it. They built it. And they literally picked up, moved to Bellevue. and they moved to other places all over the place. So Amazon abandoned Seattle. Now you're seeing Starbucks announced earlier this year that they are laying off a whole bunch of people here in Seattle, Washington. You can't think of anything more Seattle than Starbucks. And they are building a new headquarters in Nashville. Now they keep saying, "Oh no, we're not abandoning the headquarters." But according to my sources, the last round of layoffs that Starbucks did was actually the janitors. And you only lay off the janitors when there's nobody left to clean up for. I actually did my show broadcasting from outside of Starbucks, and they have these shuttles that take people to parking lots they have in the area around Starbucks. There's nobody in them. And we were there during rush hour. I'm an afternoon drive host. There was nobody in the shuttles because there's nobody there anymore. So I guess maybe the last round of layoffs will be the shuttle drivers who don't have anybody to drive around anymore. Now the janitors and everybody else don't need anywhere else to park.
Wow. Okay, so sounds very familiar, this whole infiltration. Um, but one of the biggest concerns, okay, for my audience is a dramatic rise in anti-Semitism. Has Tell us about how that has happened in Seattle, what's going on there with regard to anti-Semitism. Walk us through that.
Sure. So the way I got politically involved was the homeless crisis is out of control here. And this may sound familiar to a lot of your listeners, but what happens is a lot of big cities realize they can make a lot of money off homeless. So what they do is they say, well, if you give us more tax money, if you vote for more taxes, we can spend it and fix the homeless problem. And they never actually fix it. There's no incentive to fix it. So they keep funding it and funding it and funding it. What happened was the homeless, or I should say the taxpayer funded drug addicts, they started moving into the Jewish cemeteries. The Seattle Jewish community was actually created as a Bikur Cholim society, which is helping the sick. It was created for that, for a lot of people who are moving out west, during westward expansion and the Alaskan gold rush. And a lot of those people actually ended up dying. They found disease. They didn't find gold or anything else. They found death. So you needed a burial society. Our synagogue was funded as a burial society, and it exists to this day. And it pays a lot of the bills for the synagogue. So what happened was the addicts and the prostitutes and the dealers and the drug runners and everything else started operating out of our cemeteries. That's how bad it was. The cemeteries are in a different part of Seattle, and they started operating out of them. We would find pimps and johns in the cemeteries. It was an absolute disaster. And I thought, young, naive Ari Hoffman, this was back in 2017. I thought, oh, I'm going to fix this. I'm just going to go to the city council and I'm just going to tell them that, they got this real problem. Well, instead, it seemed like they were doing everything they could to continue the problem and not help us and avoid talking to us. So I started going to the media. I started doing hits on the media talking about how bad the problems were. I would provide them pictures of the drug use, of the feces, of the needles, of the people you would find having sex among the tombstones. It was crazy. It was really that bad. This made international news. I even did an interview in Yiddish one time where I had no idea what the other guy was saying, explaining how bad this had gotten. And the city refused to do anything about it. It ended up costing us about $300,000 to deal with the problem, to get new gates and new fences and electric gates. And then what ended up happening was, the way we really solved it was, I used to be an NCSY director. It's a Jewish youth group. And I asked some of the alumni of the youth group who had served in the IDF and now did private security to come secure the cemetery. And we had to bring guards to the cemetery because that's how bad it got. And no politician would help us. No politician would do anything about it. This is a feature of the Democrat Party here in Seattle. To show you how nothing has changed and it's only gotten worse, fast forward to today. The Jewish News Syndicate broke a story about the Democratic Party platform here in Washington, where now they are blaming Jews for anti-Semitism. They are blaming Israel for anti-Semitism. And the longtime Jewish organizations that are supposed to be combating anti-Semitism here, most of them haven't done anything to address it. Since October 7th, there's been a lot of fundraisers, but there hasn't really been much action. A few of them help out with legal help, but you might remember there was a concert with Macklemore. Macklemore is a rapper who was big in the mid 2010s. And he had a concert in Seward Park, which is the Jewish neighborhood, a park nearby in the amphitheater on the Jewish Sabbath. And that was the one where he said F America, and there was this whole national outrage over it at the time. Well, they did it purposely in the Jewish neighborhood on the Sabbath to target us. Nobody ever has concerts in that area. You're talking about activists who targeted a Stand With Us, which is an Israel advocacy group, a fundraiser. 100 activists showed up to block people from coming into it, throwing fake blood on people, throwing themselves in front of people. That was just a few months ago. You had these anti-Israel activists take over the University of Washington. They established in one of these Gaza encampments where they were assaulting people, where they were vandalizing the property, and the professors were part of it on the college campus. You had these activists shut down the I-5 freeway on January 6, 2024, blocking ambulances, blocking first responder vehicles. And I never hear any politicians talking about it. I never hear any politicians say anything about it because every politician out here, for the most part, is a Democrat. And they know that this mob will turn on them if they step outside of it just a little bit. So what's happening is there have been a few Democrats in the state legislature who have spoken out against this, and now they are being targeted, they are being primaried by members of the Democratic Socialists of America because they weren't left enough. And I'm talking about far, far, far left, where all they did was say, hey, you know what, maybe this justice reform thing isn't working. Can we look at something else? Or maybe this anti-Semitism is bad. Can we do something to address it? They agree with them on everything else. They agree with them on trans rights and gay rights and all this other stuff. And they step out just a little bit out of line. And now we have the executive director of the Council for American Islamic Relations, CARE, which is an unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation trial, the largest terror financing trial in U.S. history, is now one of the people who is running for office against the far left Democrat here in Washington. That is how bad it gets. And I look at it right now, and it seems like the Republicans are completely outclassed when going head to head with this because they have infiltrated every single level. And for the people who are the moderate Democrats, and there's not many of those left, they're afraid of angering the mob, so they won't do anything to challenge the mob.
Wow. It sounds like a very difficult situation if you're Jewish in Seattle. Um, are there is the police helpful in securing the shuls and the schools? Is there a big police presence outside of these places? I know defund the police was a tremendous movement in Seattle.
So what happened was in 2020, after George Floyd, there were riots in Seattle. And even though that happened in Minneapolis, the activist culture here decided to riot. We lost 800 plus police officers. And that's a huge amount of police officers for a city our size. We are still operating below minimum safe levels. I'll tell you this. I don't remember the last time I got pulled over and I drive like a maniac. I really don't remember the last time I got pulled over. You can do whatever you want here in Seattle.
One benefit I see.
There is one benefit, but it's probably not the safest thing, I will say. So what happens is, I know that when you go to New York and you go to synagogue services on Sabbath, there's always a cop car outside, and there's always sometimes multiple cop cars outside, especially at the big synagogues. When I go home to visit my family, there's always cops outside, and they're directing traffic and doing crosswalk duty in Westchester. We don't have cops outside. We have to hire our own security because they don't have enough cops to send to protect us. When we had a threat on the synagogue because we had the new president of University of Washington who's trying to make nice after the Gaza encampment, when we had him, we had to hire so many armed guards because we were being targeted by activists that the police sent a unit. Very nice. Thanks so much, guys. Really appreciate the one unit. We had to hire, I think it was 10 security guards, 4 squad cars to secure our synagogue. In our synagogue in Seattle, Washington, you are more likely to get shot by a congregant than a terrorist because so many people are packing on Shabbos. We have to, the people who sit at the front of the room, if you've ever been to a synagogue before, usually you have the rabbi and you have the president and you have a few other people who sit up on the dais. Whoever's sitting up there is not always the president. It's usually the person who's the best shot in the building because then they can see who's coming in from the back door and they can tell everybody else who's sitting in the pews what's going on. Because unfortunately, though the police say we want to help you, and from time to time they are helpful, for the most part, they don't have enough manpower to respond to anything. So the day of that concert I mentioned, when the activists started making their way up to the synagogues, we took it upon ourselves to close the streets because they wouldn't give us the permits to close the streets to keep the synagogue safe. We did it ourselves with our security guards. And you literally had guys with the tzitzis, with the fringes hanging out and their guns on full display standing outside the synagogues to protect them from the activists.
Wow, that's unbelievable. And that's on a weekly basis. You have a lot of people in the shul itself packing and uh standing guard.
We, after October 7th, one of the sponsors of my show was a gun store. And our routine became for about 6, 7 months after October 7th. It was go to a pro-Israel rally and then go to the gun range. And a lot of people who didn't own firearms before went and bought firearms and got trained in firearms. And we were going literally every single week. And, there are some other synagogues that are not as, shall we say, right thinking as we are, and they don't take security as seriously. But the Orthodox community takes security very, very seriously, especially since all this, especially since being targeted.
Wow. In New York, I think that's the case also, but maybe not as much as what you're describing, but I think that has been become the culture here also. So as we watch the New York primaries, and as I watch them, I couldn't help but wonder if we're seeing the same type of beginning of political movements that transform Seattle. So do you see parallels? Do you see this similarity, the seeds being sown here? And are the candidates' policies, the slogans, does all of that remind you of where Seattle was, say, 10 years ago?
Yes, but it's a little different. It's actually a cut and paste. That's what I'm seeing as number one. So you guys might remember a few years ago, you had the bail reform law in New York, which was releasing all these criminals. That idea came from Seattle. It was based on a program here called the Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion Program, where they basically just didn't send anybody to jail and kept turning loose these criminals again and again and again. The documentary Seattle is Dying was actually focused on one guy. One part of it was focused on one guy named Travis Berge. Travis Berge was arrested and convicted 75 times at the time of the documentary. It went up a lot more during that. He was actually inside the deadly autonomous zone in 2020. And how did Travis Berge meet his end? The guy who they kept turning loose time and time again. Travis Berge killed his wife by driving nails into her head in a public park in Seattle that was at the center of the autonomous zone a few months after that thing was broken up, and then drowned himself in a vat of bleach that was used to clean the fountains of the park. That's how that guy ended. Now, the New York bail reform law cited Seattle's law of the Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion Program and said, oh, this is a great model. The problem was at the time, there was no data showing that the LEAD program was a good model whatsoever. If you still ask them for their data, I have met with them. They cannot produce their data at all to show that any of this is working. So New York just said, hold my beer. We'll do the exact same thing. And look what's happened in New York to New York streets. Now let's take it to the political level for a second. You look at Zoran Mamdani and you look at all these other DSA activists that are now going to be in Congress, most likely because it's a vote blue no matter who in their districts. This is exactly what happened here in Seattle. They just kept challenging them with more and more left people. They said the Democrats are more powerful than the Republicans, so all we got to do is get the D slapped on our name. And what they do is they infiltrate at the party level. Look, most people do not go to the Republican or Democrat parties because they're boring. They're really boring. They sit around, they discuss precinct committee officers and bylaws. And look, I go to shul and I'm on the synagogue board, and that's about all the time I got for bylaws. I don't want to discuss that any other place. So who wants to go to these things? It's the worst party ever. There's no party in any of these parties. So the activists realized nobody wants to go. They took over the parties so they could endorse the candidates they want, get the D next to their name, knowing that dumb Democrats will vote for whoever has the D next to their name, not actually research them. I'll give you an example out of Seattle. A few years ago, there was a woman named Uba Gardir who was running for office for the King County Council. Uba Gardir was a Somalian and she was running for office. And nobody did any research. They just said, look, she could be the first Somali woman who's ever been elected and she's a Democrat and how amazing it is. I did one Google search on her. One. And the story came up from 10 years beforehand where she had walked onto a school bus filled with children and threatened to blow it up. One. Nobody even looked at this at all. She was convicted of that, sent to mental health help for that. Now, the Democrats still endorsed her after that. And Democrat politicians still endorsed her after that. I think she only got 3% of the vote after that because nobody can get behind that. It was like our own little version of Graham Plattner. You can't possibly vote for a person this crazy. But here's something else that shows you how Seattle insanity spreads. At the time when her race was done, I was getting ready for another story, which I kind of dropped because this was 4 or 5 years ago. Her donations were coming from daycares in Minneapolis. And I
Wow.
thought to myself,
Wow.
wait a minute, wait a minute. Why is this money coming out to a candidate in Seattle, Washington? She went away. I dropped the story. I didn't look into it. Maybe I could have been Nick Shirley. Who knows? But the case is that I just, didn't think much of it, especially when I was looking at these daycares and going, why are they in shopping centers and there's no playgrounds anywhere? But unfortunately, the news cycle took over and the story just went away and something else came up and I lost track of it until the Nick Shirley video came out. And wouldn't you know, we found a whole bunch of Somalian alleged fraud here in Washington, which the officials are refusing to do anything about.
So, um, do you think that what's going on in New York, do you see this very similarly to how it went in Seattle?
Absolutely. You look at the exact same thing. We have the exact same kind of people. I mean, look, Zoran Mamdani's not a socialist. Zoran Mamdani is a jihadi Marxist. Let's be real about this. He makes all these promises. He promises all this free stuff, and he can't deliver on any of it. His grocery store, I spoke to my friends who I have a friend who owns a grocery store locally, and I said, how much would it cost to open a grocery store right now the size of your grocery store? And he goes, somewhere between $3 and $7 million. I go, so why is Zoran Mamdani saying it's going to cost $30 million to open a grocery store? He goes, because he's using government money and he doesn't care. It's going to be out of business in a week. It's going to be out of business in a month. He'll fund it for a little while. These same socialist ideas, this infiltration, is exactly what happened to the Democrat Party in New York. They intimidate anybody, but there's a new feature in it out there. Though I've talked about all the anti-Semitism here in Seattle, here in Washington, until recently, they weren't running on it. That wasn't a feature of their campaign. Now, what I'm seeing in New York and in Washington, for that matter, is, well, it's the Jews. We're giving all this money to Israel, but the money should really be spent on health care for all, or it should be spent on universal income, or it should be spent on our grocery stores or anything else. They're using the Jews as a scapegoat. And anybody who's studied our history knows exactly how this ends every single time. But now they are running on it. Whereas beforehand, it was subtle. It was behind the scenes. Oh, shut up, Jews. That's what it was. Now they are using it as part of their campaign platform. And it is exactly the same thing I'm seeing in New York as I've been seeing in Seattle, Washington. We were a little ahead of you guys, but it is literally the same thing, shot for shot.
Wow. So looking ahead, do you think that Seattle can change course? What lessons should every American, not just New Yorkers, take from Seattle's experience about the importance of local elections? Can you see anything changing here at this point?
Well, let's take our Jewish friends for a second. The first thing is everybody has to stop sending their kids to Harvard, Columbia, and all the other schools. I thought October 7th would have been an opening for that. You know what you need to do instead? Not every kid belongs in college. And you should be sending your kids to the trade schools and they can take over the unions and then they can endorse whoever they want. For conservatives, we really suck at that. We should really be saying, well, we hate these colleges so much instead of, oh my God, my kid got into Harvard and Columbia and Yale, which I can't believe Jewish moms are still doing. You should be saying, my son got into trade school and he has no debt whatsoever. And I didn't have to shell out a lot of money for it. And all that money I saved for him, I helped them buy a house in the 5 towns or wherever it was. And that's where I went. And now look at the life they have. Look how fantastic. Look at their wife, look at their kids, and he can fix my car. And he gave me a new kitchen. And, or whatever the case may be. That's what should be. And in the process, you can take over the trade unions. Here's something else, is that people need to start going to their local parties. And I know it's boring. But why can't, for example, out in Long Island or other places in Brooklyn, why can't you have a whole bunch of people who are like-minded? We can't have a bunch of Jews work together with conservatives to go into these parties and say, socialists, you're gone. Even if you identify as Republicans, go into the Democrat Party, take it over. You will outnumber the activists if you show up with an army like that and say, we're in charge now. Call a vote. Call a vote and endorse the most conservative candidate you possibly can on the Democrat ticket. And the Democrats around there will vote for him because there's a D next to his name. And that's that. Nobody's involved in their local politics. But unfortunately, what's happening is look at Lee Zeldin's election. So many people moved out of New York during COVID, they went to Florida. So Ron DeSantis wins by a 20-point spread. Lee Zeldin loses by about 400, 500,000 votes. That's roughly the amount of people who went to Florida. Would have been a much closer vote if all those people hadn't left. Too many people just say, we're out of here. And believe me, I'm not going to fault them. I completely understand why they're leaving, given everything that's happening in these cities. But if you don't get involved in your local elections, nothing's going to change. Out here, we have a citizen action group called Let's Go Washington. This time on the ballot, They have an initiative to repeal the recently passed state income tax. We didn't have one until recently. They have one to make sure that boys are out of girls' sports, and they have one to make sure that parents know what's going on with their kids in public schools. That was all done by local citizens stepping up and gathering signatures, gathering hundreds of thousands of signatures to get those issues, 80-20 issues, on the ballot this November. It can be done, but people actually have to step up and do it. Voting is not enough. Watching Fox News is not enough. You need to actually go and get involved, or nothing's going to change.
Do you think that that's happening in Seattle? Is it, well, forget do you think, is it happening in Seattle?
It's happening in Washington. Whether or not it's happening in Seattle is a different story. Much like New York, you have New York City, which is very, very blue, and then you have New York State, which is not very blue, which is actually very red, especially big parts of Long Island and upstate New York. You see it happening in Washington State. The issue right now is for years and years and years, they said, well, we can't win in Seattle, so why even bother trying? The DSA couldn't win 20 years ago. They played the long game with infiltrating until they took over every part. It is a long game. It will take time, but you have to start at some point, and you will lose elections. But you got to start at some point, and you got to do that. And something I've been yelling at our Republican Party about for years is the reason you get a socialist Katie Wilson in the mayor's office here in Seattle is because the Republicans are like, well, that Democrat's not as bad as that Democrat, so maybe we should back this Democrat and not that. Where's the Republicans? Where's the Republicans? Where'd you even try to get a Republican? Where are you guys showing up to the party? And unfortunately, that's how you end up with this, is voter apathy.
Wow. So you actually seem a little optimistic that things can reverse.
They can, but it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of money. And some people don't have the stomach for it. I mean, look, the amount of death threats I get are absolutely insane. And somebody said to me one time, where do you get the most death threats from? And I said, it's not because I'm a conservative. It's because I'm Jewish. It's because the amount of people just want to kill the Jew. I get them from the far right and the far left. And I mean, I get them from the people who don't like conservatives either. But some people don't have the stomach for that. You will be in the spotlight. Or you could do the stuff where you infiltrate the party at the party level together with a group of people and do it. And that's more for a lot of other people, but it can be done. You just have to be willing to do the fight. And the fight sometimes takes 5 years. It sometimes takes 10 years. It sometimes takes 20 years. But the DSA, that's exactly what they did. The WTO protests, which we mentioned at the beginning of this, the riots, were in what, the late 90s? They've been working on this since the late 90s. It's now 2026, and they have full control over the government, when back then there were just a few protesters.
Wow. Okay. So sounds like we conservatives have a lot of work to do, a lot of things, but it seems like it can be done. Um, are efforts underway in Seattle at this point, in your opinion?
I'll say there's efforts underway in Washington. There's efforts underway in King County, which is the county which Seattle is in. The efforts underway in Seattle itself, not really. I would say that the problem is a lot of people have moved. I mean, my synagogue, for example, and these were not political people, but my synagogue during COVID, when everybody lived out here working for tech, they all moved when you could work remotely during COVID. So there's a lot less of them. The issue now is Seattle, for the first time, excuse me, Washington, for the first time in its history, has had a net negative migration because so many people are leaving. And with the income tax that the Democrats just passed, so many people, so many companies just said, we're out of here. Howard Schultz, for example. Howard Schultz is a pretty big lefty, but even it was too much for him. He said, I'm out of here. Jeff Bezos, before that, when they did the capital gains tax, he said, I'm out of here. They took their millions and they left. Howard Schultz took Starbucks with him and he left, even though he's not really in charge anymore, but they left. So the problem is, how many people are left to fight? And a lot of people have said, if we don't stop this income tax on the initiative this time, we're out of here too. So we're basically at a precipice where, yeah, people have put in a lot of work, but if they fail this time, they're calling it quits.
Wow. It sounds though that it's being contained to Seattle, and that's very good. So that is something that we in New York could look to with optimism, that what's happening in New York City maybe can be contained and not spread like a cancer to the rest of the state and to other states across the country.
Well, the problem is to be careful of is the state legislature, because here they did the same thing at the state level. So what they've been doing is they've been redistricting and they've been infiltrating these other areas in the state, working their way in. And unfortunately, what's happening in Seattle is happening other places where there's nobody involved on the Republican side in their local parties. So that's a cautionary tale of what can happen, but it also shows the pathway back, which is in these smaller areas, school boards, city councils. You could take those over, and actually, our GOP here has had a lot of success taking over school boards and city councils, fighting their way back to take these places over, working their way towards the Washington state legislature, which, if they're not careful, the Democrats are going to have a supermajority and be able to do whatever they want and not even have to care what the Republicans want anymore.
Wow. So Ari, let's have a final question. You've had a front row seat to one of the most dramatic political and cultural transformations of any major American city. If there's one lesson that New Yorkers and really all Americans should take away from Seattle's experience as they head into the election season, what would it be? What would you say to people who believe, oh, this could never happen here?
Oh, it absolutely can, and it already is. And I'll say this also. I know that a lot of people in the audience think that because they listen to your show or because they watch Fox News or because they read the New York Post, that they're politically engaged. Let me tell you something, guys, you are not politically engaged unless you are politically involved in the party. And you may hate half the things the party stand for, but unless you actually get involved in the party, that's how you change it. There's a line from the West Wing, which is Sam Seaborn, Rob Lowe. He says, what, you don't like the NRA? Why don't you just show up with 1 million members, take over the NRA and call a vote? Why can't we do the exact same thing to the Democrat Party? You got a lot more people than those activists. The activists we know are a small percentage. We know that in the most recent elections with Zoran Mamdani candidates, these people won with 30,000, 40,000 votes. There's a lot more Jews than that in Brooklyn. There's a lot more Jews than that in the Bronx. Show up and actually vote. Get involved in your local parties. And you might actually move some elections. And that's exactly what happened in 2024. You're able to win the swing states because you got all these people who weren't involved in politics before to show up for the vote like the Amish. And guess what? You start changing things in Pennsylvania, and then you get Donald Trump in the White House. That can be done, but people actually have to show up and do it. And I know it's hard, especially for the Orthodox Jewish listeners of your audience. They're going to say, I got my kid's school, and I got my PTA, and I got my shul, and I got the pro-Israel fundraiser, and I got the Stand With Us dinner, and I got the ADL dinner, and I got somebody's bar mitzvah, and I got somebody's wedding, and I'm planning my kids this. Okay, you make time for other things, right? So why can't you make time for this?
Wow. Well, thank you so much. Ari, thanks so much for joining us today. Your perspective is especially valuable because you've lived this story and covered it every step of the way. We've discussed it over the past several weeks that local elections really matter and they shape our schools, our neighborhoods, our public safety, our economy, and ultimately the direction of the country. So whether you see Seattle as a warning, a success story, or something in between, one thing is really certain. Informed citizens make better decisions. I hope today's conversation encourages our listeners to stay engaged, ask questions, understand not just the candidates, but the ideas and policies that they're voting for. And Ari, again, thank you so much for being with us. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I hope you'll come back and join us again.
My pleasure. Anytime, Trudy.
To our listeners, thank you so much for spending part of your day with us. You can hear Nothing But the Truth every Thursday night at 9:30 p.m. on the radio. But if you missed any part of the broadcast, or if you'd like to hear this episode again, along with all of our other episodes, you can find Nothing But the Truth with Trudy wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe, leave us a review, and share it with your friends and family. Knowledge is power, and an informed citizenry is the foundation of a strong democracy. Until next time, I'm Trudy Stern. Stay safe, stay informed, and keep seeking nothing but the truth.